When they led her to the stake, she didn't understand why all these people were looking at her with such gazes. It all started with one simple accusation, but it was this that turned her life upside down forever. "You are a witch!" These words escaped the priest's lips, and at that moment her fate was sealed. This gaze, full of fear and disdain, would haunt her for the rest of her life. In the Middle Ages, a woman who was suspected became an enemy of society. The fates of women accused of witchcraft or other crimes were often decided in court, where the evidence was the most absurd thing. It was a time when fear of the unknown and the thirst for power combined to create the most terrible punishment imaginable for a woman at that time. But in reality, punishments in the Middle Ages were so cruel and humiliating that even today we can hardly imagine them. Moreover, the woman wasn't always guilty of what she was accused of. In the Middle Ages, women were given a specific place in society. They were supposed to be wives, mothers, and keepers of the hearth. Their whole life revolved around the family, and any deviation from these norms was seen as a threat to the order. But what happened to women who didn't fit into this mold? What happened to those who dared to show independence or break societal norms? For such women, one of the most terrifying punishments awaited: shame, which turned them into outcasts of society. But perhaps the most terrifying accusation was witchcraft. The fate of women accused of witchcraft was dreadful. The fear of witches in the Middle Ages was so great that even the slightest suspicion could lead to a cruel punishment. People believed that women with knowledge of herbs, medicinal remedies, or unusual abilities could be servants of the devil. This accusation was so terrifying that anyone suspected could be severely punished. Stories of the tortures women accused of witchcraft endured still shock us. One of the most brutal practices was the water trial. A woman was tied up and thrown into the river. If she drowned, it was considered that she was innocent, and her death was seen as punishment for the evil she had done. If she survived, she was considered a witch, and a fiery death awaited her at the stake. But this was only the beginning. There were other tortures: burning, being tortured with hot irons, the breaking wheel. Each of these punishments not only tortured the body, but also tore the woman's soul, turning her into a symbol of fear and hatred. The Church in the Middle Ages played a key role in society's life. It not only defined moral norms, but also actively participated in judicial processes. Women at the time had to face the cruelest side of religion. For example, accusations that a woman violated moral norms or committed adultery often ended in public flogging, as well as banishment from the community. Judges, usually priests, often based their decisions on religious dogma, not evidence. Suspicion, rumors, and harassment became the basis for harsh punishments. Many women in the Middle Ages tried to make a living as herbalists, healers, and wise women. At the time, these women played an important role in society, as there were no other means of curing diseases. But this profession was often viewed with suspicion, and women working in this field were subject to harsh accusations. They had to not only defend their knowledge, but also their lives. Any unfortunate incident or illness of someone in the community could become grounds for accusations of witchcraft. Women who treated with herbs became targets in the witch hunts. Even if their methods were harmless, it didn't save them from punishment. Women who showed independence or had unusual abilities also fell under accusations of witchcraft. Knowledge of herbs, how to heal, and how to predict the future, all this was considered magic, and these powers were often used against them. Those women who managed to find a way out of the most difficult situations, who showed independence or tried to do something beyond the traditional norms, became enemies of society. This seemed dangerous, so many were cruelly punished. Trying to understand what it meant to be a woman in the Middle Ages, one can only imagine the horror these brave and strong women had to face. Every day was a test, and every step they took was a danger of being accused of something for which they could be publicly and shamefully punished. The shameful punishments for women became not only physical pain, but also emotional devastation. If a woman ended up in prison or was subjected to torture, her life became a nightmare. But the worst part was that society rejected her. In such a situation, a woman became an outcast and could lose everything: her family, her honor, and her future. One of the most terrifying punishments for women was public execution. Women accused of witchcraft or adultery were often subjected to public humiliation in front of the whole town. They were displayed on the pillory, put on public display, and forced to stand, subjected to mockery and insults. In more serious cases, such as accusations of witchcraft, women were often executed. One of the most popular executions at the time was burning at the stake. The stake became not only a place of death, but also a symbol of the destruction of female strength and independence. Being a woman in the Middle Ages meant living in constant fear, always a step away from accusations that could destroy your life. Even the smallest mistake, any trivial harassment, or the slightest deviation from the norm could lead to the most terrifying consequences. Women in the Middle Ages, especially those who became victims of accusations of witchcraft or other improper actions, often found themselves in a situation where their life depended on the slightest accident. But at that time, accusations were often made not based on evidence, but on personal animosities, prejudices, or even political intrigue. The unjustified fear of black magic and witchcraft in the Middle Ages was a powerful driver for various acts of violence. A woman accused of having a connection with demons or making deals with the devil became a symbol that evil could penetrate the very soul of a person. The story of these women was not only tragic, but also full of unbearable suffering. One of the most vivid examples of such fear was the Salem witch trials, but in Europe, the witch hunts were much longer and more brutal. Women suspected of witchcraft were subjected to tortures that often included cruel physical punishments, such as stretching on the rack or using various tools to prove their guilt. These tortures were designed to extract a confession, which was then used for a public execution. Women accused of adultery often had to endure the humiliation of public flogging. Different countries had their own traditions of such punishments. Women were displayed for all to see, tied to a post and subjected to cruel flogging. This was not only a punishment, but also an attempt to emphasize the helplessness and vulnerability of women in society. Even more brutal was the punishment of being sentenced to lifetime hard labor as slaves. Such women often became powerless and had to work to exhaustion in order to survive. However, even after this, they remained completely dependent on their masters or those who freed them from shame. Women sentenced to such labor could no longer return to society as full members. One of the most terrifying phrases for women in the Middle Ages was that every woman who showed even the slightest desire for independence or dissent was subjected to cruel repression. When a woman tried to step outside of societal standards, she was considered a threat to the entire order. This was a kind of harm to society that had to be eliminated. However, women accused of improper actions were often used as victims to scare others. The fear of female independence was so strong that society required these frightening examples to always remain visible. Thus, punishments in the Middle Ages were not only for crimes, but also a symbol that women should not step outside their natural roles. Women who caused fear or envy among others often became victims who needed to be destroyed to eliminate the threat. Sometimes women in power were not the victims of persecution, but on the contrary, became the main suspects. For example, the story of Catherine de' Medici, the wife of King Henry II of France, is well known. Despite her enormous role in governing France, her reputation was tarnished by numerous rumors that she allegedly used poisons and potions to strengthen her power. Catherine de' Medici became the embodiment of that dangerous woman who could manipulate people with witchcraft and magic. Behind her back, rumors circulated that she used poisons to eliminate her enemies and rivals. Some historians believe this was part of a political game to discredit the woman in the eyes of society. Nevertheless, she was accused of being behind several deaths and conspiracies. This was the moment when women with power became not only targets of criticism, but also symbols of how society perceived women who stepped beyond the norm. A woman's power, whether in politics or personal life, was always under strict scrutiny. Today, we know that most women who were executed for witchcraft had no magical abilities, and their accusations were based solely on fear and prejudice. However, in the Middle Ages, such witch hunts became the norm, and no one doubted the justice of these brutal punishments. The tragedy lies in the fact that many of these women were simply victims of their circumstances: poverty, female vulnerability, or the desire to be free. Their suffering went unnoticed, and history often forgets these innocent victims. The most terrible thing is that women in the Middle Ages not only couldn't defend themselves from accusations, but were doomed to shame, even if they were accused without any grounds. The entire history of the Inquisition and witch hunts reminds us of the importance of remembering the past and striving to create a society where women can be protected from injustice and violence. It was not only dangerous but tragic to be a woman in the Middle Ages. The history of that time reveals many dark sides of the human soul and shows how women were vulnerable in a cruel world where they had no right to their freedom, personal opinion, or even life.